They thought he was lying. They thought the dog tags around his neck were fake. In a courtroom filled with whispers and judgment, an old man stood alone, calm, silent, and proud. The judge didn't see a hero. He saw a problem. With one command, everything changed. "Remove those fake ones," the judge said. The room went quiet. No shouting, no anger, just a slow breath and a memory that refused to stay buried. What the judge didn't know was this. Those dog tags had survived gunfire, explosions, and brothers lost in war. They were earned with blood, not words. And when the truth finally came out, the courtroom would never forget what it had done. Stay till the end, because justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in wearing dog tags. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Every bench was occupied. People sat stiffly, whispering to one another, eyes drifting again and again toward the old man, standing near the center of the room. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't look important. He wore a faded jacket, neatly buttoned, and beneath it a plain shirt. Around his neck hung a pair of dull metal dog tags, resting against his chest. His hands were steady as they lightly touched them, not to show them off, but as if to remind himself they were still there. This man's name was Daniel Harper, a retired veteran, a survivor of a war most people only remembered through documentaries and faded photographs. But today, none of that seemed to matter. At the front of the courtroom, the judge leaned back in his chair, peering over his glasses. His expression wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the look of a man who had already made up his mind. The charge wasn't criminal. It wasn't violent. Daniel was accused of impersonating a military veteran. A clerk had noticed the dog tags when Daniel came to testify as a character witness in an unrelated case. Someone whispered, someone questioned, and suddenly the story shifted. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Harper," he said, his voice echoing slightly, "do you claim those dog tags are yours?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Because according to preliminary checks, your name does not immediately appear in our accessible military records." Daniel didn't flinch. Records get lost. Men don't. "I served," Daniel replied quietly. The judge sighed. The sound of impatience, not curiosity. "These courts have seen far too many cases of stolen valor," he said. "Men pretending to be heroes for sympathy, benefits, or attention." Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. "I'm not pretending," he said. The judge leaned forward. "Then remove the tags," he ordered. "If they're real, we'll verify them properly. If they're fake, there will be consequences." A silence fell so deep it felt unreal. Daniel's fingers closed around the chain. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but memory. Explosions. Dust. Shouting over gunfire. A friend's hand slipping from his grip. He had buried men wearing identical tags. Slowly, Daniel lifted his hands and unclasped the chain. The metal made a soft sound as it slid free, a sound that carried more weight than anyone in the room realized. He held the dog tags in his palm, not trembling, not pleading, just holding them. "Your Honor," Daniel said calmly, "these tags came off a machine in 1972. They were stamped before I ever learned how to be afraid." The judge gestured sharply. "Place them on the desk." Daniel walked forward. Each step echoed like a countdown. When he placed the dog tags on the wooden surface, the sound was unmistakable, a hollow metallic clink that somehow silenced every whisper in the room. The judge picked them up, examining them briefly. "Old replicas exist," he said flatly. That was when Daniel finally looked up. Not angrily, not defensively, but with disappointment. "I didn't wear them today to prove anything," he said. "I wore them because I don't take them off." The judge frowned. "And why is that?" Daniel took a breath. "Because the men who didn't come back can't wear theirs anymore." The courtroom shifted. Someone in the back swallowed hard. The judge paused, just for a second, before setting the tags down. "We'll take a recess," he announced. "Verification will be conducted." As the gavel struck, Daniel stood alone, accused, doubted, and stripped of his dignity. But what the judge didn't know, was that the truth was already on its way. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than before. Daniel Harper sat alone on a wooden bench, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. The dog tag were gone now, locked away as evidence. For the first time in decades, his chest felt strangely empty. Not weak. Empty. Across the hall, two court officers whispered near a desk, occasionally glancing in his direction. Their looks weren't hostile, just curious, uncertain. Like everyone else, they weren't sure what to believe. Daniel didn't blame them. He had learned long ago that truth didn't always arrive first. Doubt did. As minutes stretched into silence, Daniel's mind drifted backward, not by choice, but by habit.
1971. The air had been thick with smoke and heat, the kind that burned your lungs before you even realized you were breathing it in. Daniel had been younger then, stronger, faster, still learning how fear worked. He remembered gripping his rifle so tightly his hands cramped. The sound of helicopters above them had been drowned out by gunfire. Orders were being shouted, lost, repeated, screamed again. And then there was Ethan. Ethan always joked when things got bad. Said it confused death. "Don't lose my tags, old man." He'd laughed, slapping Daniel on the shoulder. "If I don't make it back, make sure they know I was here." Daniel swallowed hard on the bench. Ethan hadn't made it back. Daniel had pulled those dog tags from his friend's neck with shaking fingers, pressing them into his palm as bullets tore through the trees around them. 2 sets of tags. 1 survivor. He had carried that weight ever since. The sound of shoes clicking against the tile snapped Daniel back to the present. A young woman stood a few feet away, holding a clipboard. She looked hesitant. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. Daniel looked up. "Yes. I'm with records," she said. "Military liaison." Daniel nodded. Her eyes dropped briefly to his chest, where the tags should have been, then back to his face. "There's a delay," she admitted. "Some older files aren't digitized, especially from overseas operations." Daniel gave a small, knowing smile. "They rarely are." She hesitated again. "For what it's worth," she added quietly, "I don't think you're lying." Daniel met her eyes. "That's worth more than you think." She walked away, leaving Daniel alone once more. Inside the courtroom, the judge sat at his bench, arms crossed. He didn't like delays. He especially didn't like uncertainty. A clerk leaned in, whispering something in his ear. The judge frowned, tapping his fingers against the wood. "Still nothing," he muttered. "Partial matches," the clerk replied. "Service number format checks out. But the unit designation is unusual." The judge sighed. "Unusual how?" "Classified at the time," the clerk said. "Some units weren't publicly logged." The judge leaned back. He didn't like that answer either. Back in the hallway, Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of proving. Tired of watching people measure his worth by documents instead of scars. He rolled up his sleeve slightly, revealing faint marks along his forearm. Old, faded, but permanent. Shrapnel. One of many. A man approached from the far end of the hall. Older than Daniel, but straighter. His walk was careful, deliberate. He wore a simple suit, but something about his posture stood out, the kind of posture that didn't come from offices. He stopped in front of Daniel. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked. Daniel looked up, studying him for a moment. "Go ahead." The man sat beside him, hands folded neatly. "I heard what happened in there," he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. The man glanced around, then leaned closer. "You didn't deserve that." Daniel let out a breath. Deserve doesn't usually factor into it. The man smiled faintly. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a few moments before the man spoke again. "You served overseas?" he asked. Daniel turned to him. "Yes." "What year?" Daniel answered without hesitation. 71 to 73. The man nodded slowly. "What unit?" Daniel hesitated, just briefly. "Most people wouldn't recognize it," he said. The man's eyes sharpened. "Try me." Daniel named the unit. The man went still. Then slowly, He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it, revealing an old, worn photograph. Two young soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, arms slung over each other's backs. One of them was unmistakably Daniel, younger, leaner, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled in decades. The other man looked eerily familiar. Daniel stared at the photo. "That's," his voice caught. The man nodded. "My brother." Daniel's throat tightened. "Ethan." The hallway seemed to fade away. "You were there," the man said softly. "With him." Daniel swallowed. "I brought his tags home," he whispered. "To his mother." The man closed his eyes, nodding slowly. "She always wondered who stayed with him," he said. "Who didn't leave him alone." Daniel looked away. "No one deserves to die alone." The man placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Thank you." A bailiff appeared at the end of the hall. "Mr. Harper," he called. "The court is ready to resume." Daniel stood. The man stood with him. "I'll be there," the man said. "Inside." Daniel nodded, strength returning to his posture. As they walked back into the courtroom, whispers filled the air again. Heads turned. Eyes followed. But this time, Daniel didn't feel alone. The judge took his seat, expression stern. "Mr. Harper," he said, "we have additional information." Daniel met his gaze calmly.
Yes, Your Honor. What the judge didn't yet realize was that the story he thought was ending was only just beginning. The courtroom doors closed with a dull thud, sealing everyone inside. Daniel Harper stood once again at the center, hands relaxed at his sides. The quiet felt different now, not heavy but tense, like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers in front of him. "Mr. Harper," he began, "we've received partial confirmation regarding your service number. However, the unit you claim affiliation with remains difficult to verify." Daniel nodded calmly. "I understand." The judge studied him for a moment. "You must understand our position," the judge continued. "False claims of military service are serious. They undermine those who truly served." Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "I agree," he said. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. The judge paused, then leaned forward. "If you agree, then why resist verification?" he asked. Daniel inhaled slowly. "I'm not resisting," he replied. "I'm waiting." "For what?" the judge asked. "For the truth to arrive," Daniel said simply. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. From the gallery, the older man Daniel had met in the hallway rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm. "May I speak?" The judge frowned slightly. "State your name." "Thomas Walker," the man replied. "Brother of Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker." A hush fell over the room. The judge glanced at the clerk, who whispered urgently in his ear. The judge's posture stiffened. "Proceed," the judge said cautiously. Thomas took a step forward, holding the worn photograph. "My brother served with Mr. Harper," he said. "They were in the same unit. I've been looking for this man for over 40 years. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The judge raised a hand. "Order." Thomas continued. "My brother wrote letters home," he said. In one of them, he mentioned a man who stayed with him when he was wounded. He said, "If I don't make it, tell Mom that Daniel didn't leave." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The judge looked down at the photograph. "You're saying this defendant served alongside your brother?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "And I can prove it." The courtroom leaned forward as one. The judge nodded to the bailiff. "Bring any evidence." A small box was placed on a desk. Inside were two sets of dog tags. One set worn smooth by time. The other slightly bent, edges nicked and scarred. Daniel's breath caught. Thomas pointed gently. "The bent ones," he said. "Those were my brother's." The judge examined them closely. "These tags were found where?" he asked. "Returned to our family by Mr. Harper in 1973, Thomas said, along with a letter written by their commanding officer. The judge looked sharply at Daniel. "You returned these?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied. "I promised I would." The judge opened a sealed envelope, removing a yellowed letter. He read silently at first, then slower. The room watched his face change. Lines of skepticism softened. His jaw tightened. The letter detailed an extraction gone wrong. Casualties. A soldier who refused to leave a wounded comrade. A man who carried both sets of tags until help arrived. The letter ended with a signature. The judge's eyes widened slightly. He cleared his throat. "This letter is signed by Colonel James R. Caldwell," he said. Thomas nodded. He later became a general. A low murmur spread through the room. The judge set the letter down carefully. "Mr. Harper," he said, his voice quieter now, "why were these records not immediately available?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because our unit didn't officially exist," he said. The judge looked up. "Explain." "We were reassigned, reclassified, and erased," Daniel said. "Some missions never happened. On paper." The judge exhaled slowly. "That complicates things." "Yes, sir," Daniel agreed. "War usually does." The judge leaned back, silent. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "I lost a cousin overseas," he said. "Records were incomplete. His family never received full confirmation." The courtroom froze. "I believe the system failed them," the judge continued. "But today I see sometimes the system just doesn't tell the whole story." Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. A clerk hurried forward, whispering urgently. The judge's eyes widened as he listened. He nodded once. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced, "we have received a call." The room held its breath. From the Department of Defense. A collective gasp echoed. "They have confirmed the authenticity of the dog tags," the judge said. "In the service of Daniel Harper." The judge paused. "And they have also informed this court that Mr. Harper's unit was indeed classified until recently." The silence shattered into murmurs. Daniel closed his eyes, not in relief, but in release. The judge stood. His voice carried weight now. "Mr. Harper," he said, "this court recognizes your service." He paused. "And this court acknowledges that you were wronged." The judge removed his glasses, setting them down. "I apologize." The word echoed. Not whispered. Not forced. Apologized. Daniel looked up, surprised. The judge continued. "You were asked to remove something that was never ours to question." The judge turned to the gallery. "Let this be a reminder," he said, "that honor does not always arrive with paperwork." He looked back at Daniel. "Your dog tags will be returned to you immediately." The bailiff approached, placing the tags gently into Daniel's hands. Daniel closed his fingers around them. Metal. Cold. Familiar. The courtroom rose, not by command but by instinct. Every person stood, even the judge. Daniel placed the tags back around his neck. For the first time that day, his hands trembled. Not from fear. From 40 years of silence finally being heard. But outside the courtroom, consequences were still waiting. The courtroom remained standing long after the gavel should have fallen. No one rushed for the doors. No one spoke. Daniel Harper stood still, dog tags resting once again against his chest. The metal felt heavier than before, not because of weight, but because of meaning. 40 years of silence had finally been acknowledged, but the room was still catching up. The judge was the first to sit down. Slowly, carefully. When he looked at Daniel now, there was no suspicion left in his eyes, only something far more uncomfortable. Regret. "Mr. Harper," the judge said, his voice steady but subdued. "Before we adjourn, there is something that must be addressed." Daniel nodded respectfully. "I'm listening, Your Honor." The judge folded his hands together. "This court publicly questioned your integrity," he said. "That cannot be undone, but it can be answered for." A murmur moved through the courtroom again. Not curiosity this time, but expectation. The judge turned toward the gallery. "Stand if you have served," he said quietly. For a split second, nothing happened. Then one man rose. Then another. Then a woman near the back. Men and women stood, some stiff with age, some straight-backed, some leaning on canes. Different uniforms remembered in posture alone. The sight stole the air from the room. Daniel's throat tightened. The judge stood again. "This man stood alone when we doubted him," the judge said. "You stand now to remind us why that doubt was wrong." The veterans remained standing. Not proud, not defiant, present. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with quiet urgency. Court staff whispered. Phones vibrated. A story was already forming, not just about a mistaken accusation, but about something deeper. Respect. or the lack of it. A senior court administrator hurried toward the judge as proceedings concluded. "Your Honor," she whispered, "this is spreading fast." The judge nodded grimly. "I expected it would." Daniel was escorted gently, not by force, but by courtesy, toward a private room adjacent to the courtroom. Inside, the air was still. Thomas Walker followed him in, closing the door softly behind them. Daniel sat down, suddenly exhausted. "You okay?" Thomas asked. Daniel nodded. "Just tired." Thomas hesitated, then spoke. "I want you to know something," he said. "My mother waited years for answers. What you did, it mattered more than you realize." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said quietly. "I did it because it was my job." Thomas smiled faintly. "That's what makes it matter." A knock came at the door. The judge entered alone. No robe now. No bench. Just a man. He closed the door behind him. "Mr. Harper," he said, "may I sit?" Daniel gestured to the chair. The judge sat slowly, removing his glasses. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I'll let assumption replace judgment." Daniel studied him for a moment. "I've learned not to take it personally," Daniel replied. "People see what they expect to see." The judge nodded. "That's precisely the problem." He leaned forward. "I've presided over cases involving stolen valor," the judge said. "Men lying, profiting, disgracing the uniform." Daniel listened. "And today," the judge continued, "I treated you as one of them." Silence filled the room. "I won't excuse it," the judge said, "but I will correct it." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Ow!" The judge straightened. "This incident will be formally documented," he said, "and so will this court's error." Thomas exhaled quietly. "And beyond paperwork?" Daniel asked. The judge met his gaze. "I intend to recommend mandatory military history and service sensitivity training for this court," he said. "Judges, clerks, staff." Daniel blinked, surprised. "That's unexpected," he said. The judge gave a humorless smile. "So was today." Outside, the courtroom doors reopened. Journalists waited, not aggressively, but attentively. Daniel stepped out, flanked by Thomas and the judge. Cameras flashed. A reporter spoke up. "Mr. Harper, how does it feel to be vindicated?" Daniel paused. He thought of Ethan, of the jungle heat, of the dog tags pressed into his palm. "I wasn't looking for vindication," he said. "I was just telling the truth." Another voice called out. "What would you say to others who doubt veterans without proof?" Daniel turned. "I'd say this," he replied calmly. "Some scars don't show up on records." The hallway fell silent. Later that day, Daniel sat alone in his car. The engine was off. The world felt distant. He held the dog tags again, rubbing the worn edges with his thumb. For years, he had avoided places like courts, avoided explanations, avoided questions. But today, something had shifted. Not just for him. His phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Sir, my grandfather served. Thank you for reminding people what that means." Daniel closed his eyes. Another message followed. "I stood in court today. I hadn't stood in years." Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Across town, the judge sat alone in his chambers. He stared at the letter from Colonel Caldwell. He thought of his cousin, of incomplete records, of how easily dignity could be stripped away with a sentence. He reached for a pen and began writing. That evening, a folded American flag was delivered to Daniel's doorstep. No note, no explanation, just a flag. Daniel stood quietly in his living room, holding it. He placed it carefully on the table beneath a framed photograph. Two young soldiers, arms over each other's shoulders. "I kept my promise," Daniel whispered. But the story wasn't over yet, because the consequences of that courtroom moment were about to reach far beyond those walls. The days that followed were quiet at first, but the ripple of Daniel Harper's courtroom vindication grew faster than anyone anticipated. News outlets had caught on to the story. Headlines screamed about a veteran accused of wearing fake dog tags and the shocking revelation that followed. Social media erupted with debates, messages of support, and even apologies from people who had doubted veterans before. Daniel watched it all quietly, with a mixture of disbelief and relief. At his home, Daniel carefully arranged his dog tags back around his neck. He held them close, running his fingers over the engravings worn smooth by decades. Each scratch told a story, each dent a memory of courage, fear, and sacrifice. Thomas Walker visited often, bringing letters, photographs, and stories about Ethan. Together, they pieced together a past that had been fragmented by war and bureaucracy. "It's strange," Thomas said one afternoon, "how one simple action, standing firm, can change so much." Daniel smiled faintly. "Truth is like that," he said. "It doesn't always arrive on time, but when it does, it makes a difference." Meanwhile, the judge who had once demanded that Daniel remove his dog tags faced his own reckoning. He delivered a formal apology in court, acknowledging the mistake and explaining the circumstances that led to the misjudgment. But he didn't stop there. He initiated a training program for all court staff, emphasizing military sensitivity, recognition of service, and the danger of assuming without knowing. Judges, clerks, and attorneys attended workshops detailing military service, its sacrifices, and the importance of recognizing veterans' contributions, even when paperwork failed to reflect them. It wasn't just about Daniel Harper. It was about preventing this from happening to any veteran in the future. Daniel also received letters from people across the country. One read, "I never understood what my father went through in Vietnam. Today, your story helped me see it." Another, "Thank you for standing your ground. You reminded us that honor cannot be questioned by assumptions." Daniel didn't respond to most of the messages. He didn't need to. Simply knowing that his story reached people, inspired reflection, and changed hearts was enough. In a small community where Daniel lived, the story transformed perceptions overnight. Local veterans who had remained quiet for years began sharing their experiences. Families of fallen soldiers found solace in knowing that their loved ones' sacrifices were acknowledged and respected. Daniel's home became a quiet gathering place, where people came not for news cameras, but for connection, understanding, and remembrance. Even a local courthouse, once a place of tension for Daniel, invited him to speak about his experiences. His words were measured, honest, and deeply moving. "We fight wars far from home, but the battles of recognition and respect often come much later and much closer to us." Every veteran carries memories that cannot be documented on paper, but they are no less real. And those memories deserve acknowledgement, not doubt. The courtroom had transformed from a place of accusation to a stage for education, respect, and healing. Yet, Daniel never forgot the silence of those first moments. When the gavel had struck, when the judge had demanded the removal of his dog tags, and when whispers filled the room. That silence had weighed on him for decades. Now, with each letter, each handshake, each message of support, the weight lifted slightly. But it never disappeared entirely, because the memories, the sacrifices, and the lessons were permanent. One evening, Daniel stood in his backyard, dog tags glinting in the fading sunlight. He thought of Ethan, the jungle heat, the gunfire, and the promise he had kept to a fallen friend. He thought of the judge, the court staff, Thomas Walker, and all the people whose hearts had shifted because of one act of courage, standing firm in truth. He realized then that valor wasn't just about bravery in battle. It was about courage in every moment where doubt, fear, or misunderstanding threatened to erase history, honor, or dignity. The final consequence of that courtroom moment was not a headline. It wasn't a gavel or an apology. It was subtle, powerful, and enduring. People began listening. They began questioning their assumptions. They began respecting stories without needing instant verification. Veterans who had previously felt invisible found voices again. Communities discovered the strength of acknowledgement. And a nation remembered, once more, that honor is not granted by paper alone, but by recognition, courage, and respect. Daniel Harper, now older, wiser, and finally at peace with the weight he carried, clasped his dog tags once more. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool metal against his chest. The story that had started with doubt ended not with revenge, but with dignity restored. And in that restoration, Daniel understood the most important lesson of all. True valor is not measured by what is questioned, but by what is lived, faithfully, courageously, and without compromise. The courtroom story became more than a lesson for a judge or a community. It became a symbol, a reminder, a beacon for all who had served, for all who had doubted, and for all who would face challenges to their honor in the future. In the end, Daniel Harper did not just reclaim his dog tags. He reclaimed respect, recognition, and a piece of history that had almost been lost. And through his actions, he ensured that the consequences of doubt, when confronted by truth, could be transformed into something greater than any gavel, any courtroom, or any official document could ever provide. The dog tags glimmered softly under the sunset, a silent testament to courage, to honor, to the enduring power of standing firm, even when everyone else doubts you.